Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Commissioner Showalter, Budget Director Mingy, and our state economist, Dr. Klamakidis, to help all of us take a look at this 30,000-foot snapshot of where Minnesota's economy and budget stands as of today. And that's a good spot where we're at. These were decisions that were made looking towards the future and looking for the best interest of Minnesotans. And the Lieutenant Governor and I, since we've had the privilege of doing this job, even before that when we were running, we talked about making sure that Minnesota's a state where every child and every family can thrive, that our tax system's fair, that we invest in the things that give people opportunity while reducing costs for middle-class folks, working people, and seniors. This budget numbers that you see, this forecast, gives us a little better view of what the future looks like. It is, again, I would remind everyone, a 30,000-foot view. And while this is a positive budget report today, it doesn't tell the whole story. And it doesn't tell the story of a parent who is having trouble finding and paying for childcare right now and are struggling with that. It doesn't tell the story of families that are still struggling with gas prices while they've come down, are still high, and food prices are still high. It doesn't tell the story about our commuters that are dependent on transit and good roads and bridges across this state to get them to their jobs and move their products if they're a business owner. And it doesn't tell the story about how we need to get the resources into our schools so that 8th grader who needs to catch up on some geometry before ending high school needs to get done. So the macro picture is solid. The golden opportunity that we have to make Minnesota an even better and fair and more inclusive and more prosperous state is there, and the opportunity to work together in the legislative bodies to make that happen is there. We have made it very clear, I think, Lieutenant Governor and myself, that we believe the things that we can do are investing in education and in our classrooms, making sure that all of the services are there, whether it's making sure every child has a meal when they come through that door, or making sure we have all the services from mental health services to the support staff in those schools, making sure our teachers have the resources to deliver and our students and their families have the capacity to make sure Minnesota schools stay the best in the country. At the same time, we start thinking about how do we close those gaps with research that's out there, making sure we have teachers that look like the students in their classrooms. We have the opportunity to make sure that we're using the federal infrastructure dollars to continue to modernize Minnesota's infrastructure, thinking towards the future, making sure our roads, our bridges, our transit systems are there, but also looking toward what does it mean to electrify our transportation grid and having those charging stations and capacity across the state so we can deal with climate change in a real practical manner by also creating jobs. And it means that we reduce some of those costs to folks, that we have the opportunity, as we've talked about, get money back in the hands of people, get some of this back in the form of rebates to people to be able to use as they see fit. And we think that we may continue to strive to make sure Minnesota's tax system remains fair, and we had the opportunity, as we've talked about, and we proposed in 2019 around the Social Security tax repeal for a large number of Minnesotans to make sure that's easier for them. We can do all of these things. This isn't a choice of either or. It's smart budgeting and invests in Minnesota's people, invests in an economy that understands where the future is going, understands that demographic changes are making it more difficult in the workforce, but ways that we can attract people back in. These are common universal themes that we heard while we were out campaigning. Make things a little easier for us. Make things a little fairer. Make sure we have the opportunity to do what we want to do. Invest in communities. I was with the counties yesterday, proposals around public safety that are holistic, ways that we can make sure that we're preventing crimes in the front end, or if we're dealing with them in real time, or what happens as rehabilitative and restorative justice programs are put into play. Those are things that our local elected and local entities are hungry for. It's the innovation that happens in those areas that the state now has the capacity to be even a better partner. But I want to be very clear. We're setting on, as you just heard Mary talking about, some historic record numbers, from historic record unemployment to surpluses. And I'll remind Minnesotans, during the term of the Walz-Flanagan administration, we have not raised taxes, we lowered them. Different buying patterns, different things that have happened. Corporate profits have raised this. We've also seen some things that have affected state spending to go down. And I think when Minnesotans are saying we need to align revenues with spending to have the best impact that we can measure and get results for Minnesotans, that's exactly the way I think all of us are looking at this. That's exactly what we should be doing. And this gives us a historic opportunity to maybe realign some of those things, but keeping in mind a state like Minnesota with a diverse economy, the fifth most diverse, with historic low unemployment rates, with historically high labor participation rates compared to the rest of the country, with innovation in job growth, with moving to address things like climate change and inequities inside our systems. All of those things positions us as well as any other state for us to be an attractive place to say, this is where I want to raise my family. This is a place I want to start my business. This is the place where I know my family can achieve what they want to achieve. So I want to give a big thank you to Minnesota's workers who have endured some of the most turbulent times that we've seen. It's certainly in a generation, maybe potentially in our state's history. And not only did they endure it, they came out innovatively. Our business owners, the same thing. Our students, our teachers. And I'd like to add too, and it looks like we're in a good space to be able to talk about this, our nurses and our healthcare systems that reached a compromise to continue to deliver world-class healthcare to every single one of our Minnesotans. So I'm going to single out a couple people that Lieutenant Governor and I had the privilege over the last few weeks, and we were out on the campaign trail. There's a young woman named Chow Trong in Northfield. She's a full-time college student. During the pandemic, she also started her own business and is hiring and building her community in Northfield. Those are the decisions that were made and the type of visions that was made that added to this budget surplus and the outlook for Minnesota's economy looking so bright. Our Helene up in the Iron Range, the #1 producer of solar panels in North America. Minnesota is going to be a leader in addressing climate change and the creation of green jobs, and that is going to bring more economic prosperity. And instead of trying to figure out how to cut the pie even further, we expand the pie to reduce the cost on individuals and open up opportunities. We are well positioned to do that. Or an entrepreneur like Shawnee Grigsby, who started Flava Coffee in St. Paul, not only seeing that as an economic opportunity, but a bridge to bridge some of the inequities that we have and bring cultural differences to the forefront so that we can address those and make sure that Minnesota, when we talk about a place to be successful, every single Minnesotan sees and hears that meant to them, that they are not excluded. So I'm excited about this. Now's the time to lower costs for families. Now's the time to reduce and get some money back in their pockets. Now's the time to make sure that those classrooms are funded with the things that they need to do to make our kids the best qualified workforce in the world and the best opportunity for individuals to thrive. So Lieutenant Governor and I are excited about this. We're excited about the work that will happen now. On January 24th, we will be releasing the budget numbers that will be reflected by this forecast, and more importantly, be reflected by the conversations and the hard work we're doing with Minnesotans in all of these different areas of ways that we can make a difference. And then, of course, we will do it in partnership with our legislative partners. You're going to hear in just a little bit here from incoming Majority Leader Dietzig from Minnesota Senate, and you're going to hear from Leader Long and Whip Hollins on what the legislative priorities are over there. We are independent branches. We share many of the same values, but we need to work together to make sure Minnesotans are reflected. And that includes working with the minorities in the House and Senate to make sure that all Minnesotans feel that they're a part of this. There's golden opportunities for us to do things on so many fronts, also including a bonding bill, which will have projects like the Dilworth Fire Hall in it. We walked away from a deal that would have made a difference in Minnesotans' lives in May. I hope the lesson that we all take from that is, when we reach a compromise deal that improves Minnesotans' life, my pro tip of the day is take it. Take it and do what's right for Minnesota, and good politics will follow that. Today, our administration, along with our partners in the House and Senate, make that commitment that we need to make sure government works for people, make sure it makes their life easier, make sure it keeps public safety as a forefront, public education at the heart, making sure the tax system is fair and reduce costs on their family, and making sure we look to the future and understand that when we do budgets, we need to talk about inflation not when it's 8.1%, but when it's year in and year out at 2%. To do budgets without talking about inflation is simply disingenuous. I stood in front of you clear back in 2018 before we were even inaugurated or sworn in when we did our first November budget forecast, and we talked about the need to start addressing honestly around inflationary costs in state budgets, and I hope that's a topic that we can bring up. And I would close before I get some some questions from all of you. The continuing strive to make sure that we are as efficient as we can possibly be, make sure that we're good stewards of taxpayer dollars, but we use new ways to find better and more innovative ways to deliver services more collaboratively. And I've said this for the last 3 years. The one silver lining that came out of COVID was it forced state government to break down some of our silos, to re-envision how we can work better together, and doing that with our private sector partners and our nonprofit partners. That gives Minnesota well positioned. We're not looking at having to reinvent the wheel, but we should be looking to make a more efficient wheel. We should be looking at ways that we can make that wheel work better for the folks who are out there, and think about what is that future horizon going to look like, and use this budget time. I'd like to think that at some point in time, some of these positive changes we can make, that we used this budget surplus and this budgetary environment and the post-COVID changes to create a more inclusive, a healthier, a more nimble Minnesota economy and state government. With that, Lieutenant Governor will take some questions.
Governor, what about inflation? Inflation is real in the economy. You cited it. It's not in the forecast, though. Past lawmakers, past governors have had inflation. Is it time for that to return to the budget forecasting process?
Yeah, and I brought this up, and again, this is going to be working with our partners. I've always said I make it sense, and trust me, I'm not naive in this. It's hard to do, but I don't think we can pass surpluses because it's frustrating to the public, too. It's frustrating to folks who see this. Well, we gave a 1.9% increase to education. Well, if real inflation that year was 2.1%, there wasn't seeing an increase, and the public is going, why do they keep asking for money? So I think we're taking very seriously in the buying power. It's when we talk about things like local government sales tax issues for projects they're doing. When we remove those, that's a real impact for some of those folks, because if we're thinking right now, projects that are out there, we were screaming on bonding bills, let's bond why we can get great rates or whatever. The rates aren't as great now, but the projects are still going to go up in cost. So my commitment on this, and I think the conversation I want us to start having is, we need to budget and budget forecast with inflation as a part of it. And again, you saw the forecasts on this. I think it's probably, if history's any indication of this, we'll start to go back to those more traditional, stable 2% unemployment rates, over the next 18 months or so, but those are always going to be there. That's just the nature of things. I think we need to forecast for it, and I think we need to have the conversation on budgeting for it. That is not government on autopilot. That is just honest budgeting. So I hope that conversation can happen.
Governor, I don't want to raise a sore subject, but you had a deal.
Of course you do. You know that.
You had the 4-4-4
yes.
Agreement, and that just sort of was a framing where you had 1/3, 1/3, 1/3.
Yep.
Do you have any similar ratios in your brain as you start to produce your budget for using this surplus?
It is a good question. And I think what that did was it left the uncertainty. And remember, you heard Commissioner Showalter talk about this. We are at historic levels in addition to this on the rainy day funds. We left the $4 billion with the idea that there'd be a new incoming group of legislators and they could have a piece of that. I think, though, with that idea of a portion of this thinking about the future, a little more cautious, a portion of it going into reduction of costs for people, either in the form of rebate checks, which we've advocated for, in addition to, I think, Social Security tax cuts, those types of things, and then the piece on the spending. I think the biggest thing I've said, and I hope I don't get misconstrued on this, I think it makes sense to look at the one-term funding where we can do that, focus on the programs that are there, but I also want to be very clear. When I say that, I'm not talking about not funding things into the future that grow the economy. If we don't figure out ways to close some of the gaps in education, we're not going to see budget surpluses in the future. If we don't build our infrastructure out, we're not going to see those. If we don't address climate change, we're going to see a negative impact on our economy that is going to lower these things, and we don't have the ability to do any of that. So I think it makes sense maybe us to view it on what is going to be in terms of short-term one-time spending versus some of the long-term commitments, and how do we make sure that when we're talking about some of those reductions in costs, and I just want to be very clear, I am going to advocate for some reductions, especially around the Social Security tax. I think you're going to see us continue to advocate, and they'll do their work in the legislature around some of these rebate checks, but I'm focusing on working class Minnesotans and senior citizens. I think the only thing I can pledge you for certain around taxes is I will not be proposing a tax cut for the wealthiest Minnesotans. That's not going to happen. With that being said, there's a lot of ideas open to be able to deal with. Tom?
Governor,
Okay, so I hear you say you're not going to cut taxes for the wealthiest. Are there other tax cuts you would consider? And then secondly, a lot of people concerned about local property taxes. You're
Yes.
seeing those rates go up in some cases exorbitantly. Will there be more money for local government
Yes.
aid and that type of thing?
Yes, good question. Again, Social Security tax. And again, what I proposed is, and we'll have this conversation amongst the legislators or whatever, we proposed in 2019 cuts to the Social Security tax by raising that limit. I think we have about 55% of Social Security recipients pay no state tax in Minnesota. If we take that ceiling up further, I simply said, I don't know if the richest Minnesotans, billionaires, need a tax cut on Social Security, but we can have that conversation. The local property tax issue, again, that is a result on when you're seeing these levy increases, that is a direct result of us not doing the deal in May. That means schools were waiting for the money to go, local government aid, county program aid, and those things. And I am going to advocate again in our budget that we increase local government aid. We do the county program aid. It's an effective way. Counties especially are delivering a lot around the human services. If we're addressing the infrastructure needs using the federal money of the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and we're making sure we're getting money out in the form of public safety, whether that be grants to community programs or for more policing, all of those things reduce costs on local governments of necessities that they have to deliver. And I've said this time and time again, folks who come to St. Paul and vote against any type of investments and then crow about their fiscally conservative need to go back and stand in front of their county commissioners and their city councils who have to plow the roads, who have to educate the children, who have to deliver services. And I think that's why you're seeing that. So I would make the case to all of those entities out there, this is a golden opportunity to reduce property taxes, and it goes back to what we've been talking about. That is a direct impact of savings to middle-class families that will have more money in their pocket to weather some of these inflationary costs.
Follow-up. It sounds like you're backing off a little bit from a total elimination of the Social Security income tax, especially for the wealthiest, and then also any other taxes you would consider for
Well, we'll get into that. When we see what's out there, child tax credits, there's some of those things that I know are going to be proposed. Again, if it's impacting positively middle-class working people and seniors, I'm for it. And just to be clear, I'm making that case on the full elimination of the Social Security tax because, again, as you see this, as we get higher and higher in retirement income that people get, the impact of that Social Security tax is almost unnoticeable to the folks making that much, but it's part of the revenue stream that goes back into delivering for seniors. But I said it and I agreed to it in May that I was open to talk about that. That deal was not taken by Senate Republicans, so now we're going to have to renegotiate on it. I am open to renegotiating with them on it.
Governor, you mentioned a couple times rebate checks. How big, how soon, and have you had conversations with your legislative leaders, the incoming leaders, about perhaps front-loading that? We
have a little bit. We proposed $1,000 per person, $2,000 per family. I was open to that. I think we have discussed this. It's no secret that it was received lukewarmly, I think, over by both chambers and probably bipartisanly. But I still go back to this. If you want to reduce some of the costs for the short run and make an impact on families, especially those who really need it, it's one of the most effective ways. So we're going to propose it again. We are willing to work to see about maybe what some of those income limits were, if they wanted to see those change. But I think for most Minnesotans out there, and I always look at this and I tell my staff when I'm doing this, if my wife and I are teaching in Mankato, how would we hear this? And what we would want to see is there's a budget surplus, and we would try and understand why that was. And then I think we would say is, well, they're going to fund education, and they're going to try and reduce costs. They're going to do some infrastructure. Those are all things that we would obviously support. But I would think that there's two teachers sitting out there saying, you've got this budget surplus, return some of it back to us in some way. Make sure that it's getting back to us. So I'm open to hearing where that's at. We know that there are many ways you can reduce costs. I want to be clear. We had a great conversation last week. One of the ways you can reduce costs for working families while increasing labor participation rates is get child care under control and fund those and make sure that child care is accessible and affordable to all families. That's a major way to put money back. So I think when we talk about these things, there's going to be the universal deal that we come to, but I am still going to advocate for direct checks sent back to people. I think the starting point would be that $1,000, $2,000 for family to make a difference. I had a couple more. Go ahead. Eric.
Governor, could you quantify what fully funding E12 means, and do you have a number in mind?
Yeah, we will come with that when the legislature meets, but I think it's the biggest thing when we talk to people about this. When I've myself talk about fully funding, both as an educator and the parent of a sophomore in Minnesota public schools. It's making sure that that student has the resources they need to be able to do what they need to get done and achieve their education. First of all, starting out, I think we're going to talk about that. We think we need to see universal meals, so this food insecurity issue is taken away. We know that we need to increase the number of mental health counselors that are there. Minnesota continues to rank near the bottom, and it's unacceptable. And then making sure those classroom teachers have what they need, and it's a diversified workforce. I think once the budget process starts to go, and I mean, think about this. This is such a new day for Lieutenant Governor and I. This is a true story. When I put my budget out and I went over and to talk to the legislatures and those that were in charge of the education, they weren't even going to hold a hearing. And as it turned out, they gave us 5 minutes. They gave us 5 minutes to present our education budget on what we would try and do. This year, I think, is going to be a different story where we can have experts that come in there, inform us on what that looks like, talk about what's effective, put in things that we can quantifiably measure what we're getting out of those investments and come up with a number. So we will put a number on it by January 24th, but I would just say I've worked in a legislative body where the committee process worked, and it is amazing what they're able to come up with. We don't claim to have all the answers. I think our legislative partners working together that we will start to get that.
Governor,
time for a couple more?
Governor, in your...
Yeah, go ahead.
Governor, since you have a very close legislative majority in the Senate, what is there need for a bonding bill? Why don't you just do a direct spending bill on that question?
Because as I said, I went to the counties yesterday. All the counties were there, all 87 tables. And I walked in and I got a standing ovation from 11 tables. So you know how this works. Actually, they're all there. And I said, you know what, and they mentioned, as all of you have, you talk about one Minnesota, but you didn't win as many counties as you did before. And I said, what it means on that is that those counties, especially in greater Minnesota, are going to get exactly what they deserve. Good roads, good schools, aid to do the things that they need to do. So I think the reason that you try and go at a bonding bill on this is because I care deeply what minority members in the House and Senate need for this. Whoever represents Dilworth has an argument that I've agreed with and will in all of these areas, that these are projects that are worthy of being funded. And I think if you go just to straight cash on this, that you may leave out some of those projects. So
Just as a follow-up, you can do the same thing with a direct spending bill, and you can get all of what you've just said accomplished, but you only need a simple majority to pass the bill as opposed to having a supermajority of 60 votes.
And I'm going to make the case, you know, and I've heard somebody say this. They say, you know what you call a one-vote majority? A majority. But I'm going to take this a little bit further to not be facetious about this, that I care about what those members have. I've been in the minority on these things. I've been in a situation when we had divided government. If there is a true desire to work bipartisanly, I think it serves Minnesota so much better that we do that in the traditional way. I would like to get the number of votes it takes to pass a bonding bill with Republican support to do that. I think that's the place where we need to start. Obviously, there's leverage to say we don't need to do that, but I think there's a large number of Minnesotans would feel like they're not being heard, that they're not being included. And I am a champion of that bonding bill. I am as committed as I was back in 2017 when Peggy and I started running, that we need to unify the state and quit dividing this, quit saying that we're not getting this, we're not going to invest in this, because I'm going to be clear in that bonding bill, there is going to be money for Lake Street that was held up. There is going to be money for Minneapolis that after we had civil unrest and families and businesses that were displaced. And those are things that benefit greater Minnesota the same way. So we'll bring it back. I think we have time for one more.
Governor.
Governor, I was wondering if you, given the size of this surplus, do you feel that, can you characterize Minnesota's tax rates as too high? Are we collecting too much revenue because these surpluses are so high?
Well, it's a fair question. I think listening to Dr. Klomakidis, is this an anomaly, a one-time, was this spending differences and federal infusion of money that caused some of this? I think we're always looking at ways that we can make sure the system is fair. I think most Minnesotans are willing to pay taxes if they feel like what they're getting for it makes sense, if they're getting a return on their dollar that makes sense. And I think this gives us a time to pause and reconfigure a little bit. That's why I'm very much open on this issue of Social Security tax. I think there's some child tax credits that we need to look at. And we've agreed before to tax cuts. We even agreed I believe in the 2019 budget to some more broader cuts that are in there. But I want to hear those conversations. I want to understand what the long-term effect of that is. I don't want to set up an imbalance or create a cliff in long-term budgeting, but I think it's a fair point to say, Does this prove that there's an opportunity for us to get the amount of services, to recalibrate what we can get for that, and to provide some relief? And again, I think the answer to that is that yes, we will want to look at that, but I'm going to make sure that I narrow those parameters. It's going to be targeted at working folks and senior citizens in that middle bracket. We're not going to have a conversation on the top tier, because it's not what Minnesotans told us on the campaign trail, and we're coming out of this. These were competing ideas. These were competing ideas that were put in front of Minnesotans, and they chose to go with us on this. So I think when we go into a legislative session, I'm keeping that in mind. Final thoughts?
Yeah, Governor, right over here to your left. In your first two budgets, you proposed some tax increases in some areas. Top tier, corporate tax, gas tax. Are you going to take a tax increase off the table in this next budget?
No, the same thing I said when we first went in. I think until we look at the whole budget, I think it's disingenuous to go into this by closing doors. The only door I closed on this is I'm not going to give a cut at those top levels. That's not going to happen. But I do think we need to look at and have a conversation when we're looking, are there areas where tax decreases and balancing makes sense? But as we think about things, and I'm just going to, thank goodness the federal government did what they hadn't done in over 40 years. They passed an infrastructure bill. I do think we need to put Minnesota on a path to think about some of these long-term funding needs around either transportation, whether it's transit or roads and bridges, to understand long-term what that looks like. So we're not proposing that at this time, but I also think it'd be disingenuous to take it off the table, because we have a responsibility to put us in a long-term stable place. So.
But Governor, if you want to pass paid leave, isn't that already saying that there's probably going to be a tax increase? I know previous proposals, it was like a over $1 billion program that would have been a bump to businesses.
There were different mechanisms on how to do that. I do think, and we are certainly supportive as an administration of a paid family leave program, especially for our smaller employers and for all Minnesotans to be able to participate in that. We think those are the types of things that that grow the economy, that make Minnesota more appealing to folks. And that's why I want to be clear that we're not saying no, but I think once again, the benefit from that, and I think most Minnesotans certainly agreed with us on this, that a proposal to have a paid family leave program is very, very appealing, and in the long run, saves families money, doesn't make them choose between being with a newborn and being at work. They can do both. Anybody else? We have final ones?
Governor, can I follow up quickly on that? Because you
Sure,
talked
then we'll
about
go
things that make Minnesota more appealing. You heard the question earlier, not only do we have record surpluses, but record unemployment. We need people to come to this state to sustain the workforce. What do you see as what you're able to do to get more people to move here and work here?
Yeah, well, I'm making the case, if you're a teacher in Florida, teach here. We allow you to teach. You're not going to hear mandates coming from the governor's office around your teaching. You're going to be able to do what our communities need you to do. I think it's making sure, again, that housing is affordable. I think we have to have a conversation, as we've said, around public safety and understand what that looks like in the long run. I think things like paid family leave and access to child care, protecting our natural resources and the ability for people to be able to enjoy those things, and continuing to make a diverse economy, no matter where you come from, religion, race, ethnic background, that you feel welcome and safe in Minnesota. And that's something that we've always done pretty well. We need to continue to do so. And again, we're not talking, I see these other states advertise and poach. We need to make sure that our business climate is conducive to folks wanting to do that. We're still seeing good business growth. It can't be the simplification, but tax policy is a part of that. And so I think having that conversation of looking, and again, the Minnesota adage of skate where the puck is going to be, everybody's kind of in this same boat. We're just further along in it and have a little more diversified economy. But one of the things we learned when our trade missions, which have proven pretty fruitful though, countries like Japan and Finland that mirror Minnesota in a lot of ways, a little more of an aging population, a fairly high outcomes around social issues like healthcare access and education levels and things like that, but a real dilemma on how to create more workforce for a time when that's becoming harder and the costs are a little bit more. So I think we're trying to learn from our partners, both here in other states, but also globally, ways we can make ourselves appealing. And I can tell you, in those trades, for example, in Finland, the Finnish leadership, all the way up to the president, was very clear. We're not going to be investing in states that aren't taking climate change and equity seriously. So as they're starting to look to states, and I think a lot of folks and companies are going to have to start to see this, if we're seeing state governments, run wars on corporations over ideological differences rather than creating a safe space where everybody's welcome here. Minnesota can do that well, and we're seeing that women's rights and women's choices on their own reproductive rights are going to be protected in Minnesota now. So as companies and businesses and families are thinking about relocating, those are things we can do. And then I think always staying welcoming to our immigrant and refugee community has been a big part of Minnesota's success story. Need to continue to focus to make sure that we do that right. So we have one more back.
Yeah, Governor, you said at one point we can do it all in terms of the relief. Battery's dead. You said that you, at one point, you believe you can do it all in terms of relief, whether it's rebates, taxes, spending. Whether or not that happens, we'll see in the months to come. But today, what would you say to Minnesotans who might be looking at property tax increases, who might be looking at those bills coming due right now? What can you say to them today on what they can count on later this year?
Yeah, I think they should have an expectation that we deliver immediate relief to them and then long-term reduction in cost to middle-class folks. Again, I'll go back to talking to the counties. These are folks that have to make the buses run on time. They have to fund the schools. And when we froze and didn't move that $9 billion, their budget still came forward to them. And so I think, and this is what I'm talking, and you're going to hear in just a moment from the legislators, and I think there's a shared commitment in this. Get your work done on time. Be very clear and transparent. Have the hearings that are out there and have the administration over there to defend some of the things that are happening. Continue to improve, but I think it's a combination, and I think the model, going back to it, was we had a good mix of reductions in cost to folks, investments in things that grow the economy, improves people's lives, all while being fiscally responsible in the long run. So if I were a Minnesota, someone sitting out there looking at what this is, my expectations is they're going to see a reduction in some of the cost to them, some improvements in things that they've asked for, whether it's paid family leave or health care access, some of those things, at the same time being good partners with local government to reduce some of those. Because this was my concern, and I, each individual entity of those governmental bodies is a little bit different, but I think it's safe to say that the inaction that we had here in St. Paul forced local governments to have to make decisions around property tax, that it's not too late for us to get that work done and provide them the relief. So I think there should be some relatively high expectations that this is an effective legislative session that addresses the issues most important to them, but also has a vision around addressing the big issues like climate change and healthcare access and those types of things. We can do that. And when I say we can do it all, we may not get everything we want, but there is certainly the capacity here to provide all of those things. And if it's about improving the lives of Minnesotans and putting our state in a better place to compete both nationally and globally, this is the legislative session to do it. I know that that's not going to be without its challenges, and I know that the folks coming up next are an independent branch of governance that will work the will of their folks who all hold an election certificate, and we will work to find some compromise. So I'm grateful you're all here. I'm glad now. I think we're going to turn it over to incoming Majority Leader Dietzick, Majority Leader Long, and Whip Hollins are going to take some questions. Ready? Let's go. Thank you. Oh, and by the way, the Vikings are 10-2. Look at that. Pretty good day, and no strike. So good work.